Welcome everyone to this webinar on emerging field practices to COVID-19 and refugee context. I am Nancy Landa, technical advisor for the pilot project Skills for Reintegration based in Mexico with GIZ. It is my pleasure to facilitate this webinar today. Before we start, I would like to tell you that this webinar will be held in English. Simultaneous translation will be provided for Spanish-speaking participants. On this slide, you can see the steps to follow to use this tool. So let me switch briefly into Spanish to explain how to access the simultaneous translation. Buenos días, buenas tardes. Antes de empezar, quisiera comentarles que este webinario se llevará a cabo en inglés. Para los participantes hispanohablantes, contaremos con traducción simultánea. En esta diapositiva podemos ver los pasos a seguir para contar con esta herramienta. Encontrarán las instrucciones en el chat una vez que hayamos empezado con las presentaciones. Si tienen algún problema técnico con el uso del servicio de traducción, pueden usar el chat para solicitar apoyo. First of all, I would like to introduce the series and framework in which we organize this webinar today. This is the 14th webinar on the social protection responses to COVID-19 webinar series. The series is a joint effort initiated by the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, IPCIG, GIZ on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Australia government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in collaboration with the socialprotection.org platform and in cooperation with the partners from different organizations. The webinar series is a part of an initiative with two other major components: a collaborative mapping of country news and documents disseminated weekly through a dedicated newsletter, and an online community on the topics to systematize information and foster discussion. Please do join the online community Social Protection Responses to COVID-19 Task Force to learn more about the whole initiative. Also to find out how to collaborate and to keep updated about future webinars. Next, I would like to mention the upcoming webinars in the series that will take place throughout the rest of the month on the 18th, 23rd, 25th, and 30th of June, which will continue some discussions on forced displacement, migration, and also school feeding programs, social contracts, and South Asia. So don't forget to register for the upcoming webinars. I would like to say welcome everyone. I work with GIZ on a project that works on strengthening networks and partnerships with the aim of facilitating integration and reintegration of migrants and returnees and refugees and other forcibly displaced persons in Mexico. And I would like to take the time to introduce our panelists for today who were kind to share their time and expertise with us. First, we have Hanna Mattinen with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, based in Geneva. You will see their bios here in the presentation, but I will briefly mention some of their experience. Hanna has a professional career with non-governmental organizations working for over 13 years in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe in various technical and management positions prior to her role in UNHCR. She currently focuses on operation methodologies that harness the opportunities that cash transfers offer in promoting forcibly displaced people's access to financial opportunities and the national system supporting cash transfers. We also have the pleasure of having Tania Niño from the World Food Program. She offers experience in humanitarian action and international development in Colombia, Asia, Africa, as well as in the public and private sector. Currently, she's the National Officer for Social Protection in the World Food Program Colombian office. And lastly, we also have Camilo Hernández from Gerencia para la Respuesta a la Migración desde Venezuela. He's the advisor to the team in charge of coordinating government responses to migration from Venezuela at the Presidency of Colombia. His career has been largely focused on the provision of social services to internally displaced populations and on the promotion of victims' rights in Colombia, and has held posts in government, UN agencies, and international NGOs. Next slide. I also would like to encourage the audience to send questions to the panelists throughout the webinar. We will make our best to address all the questions during the Q&A and at the end of the webinar. However, in case we don't have the time to answer all of them, we will also prepare a Q&A written document to be shared with the audience, and that will be published with the webinar summary and will be available on socialprotection.org following a few days after the webinar. Also, by joining the Social Protection Responses COVID-19 Task Force online community, you can also participate in the follow-up discussions about the webinar. I would like to just mention a little bit about the agenda or how the webinar will go. After the introduction and presentation of the webinar, each panelist will have 15 minutes to present. And keeping with that time, hopefully we'll have about half an hour to 35 minutes for the Q&A and any closing remarks. So with that, again, I would like to welcome you to today's topic and introduce briefly a framework or set the stage for the discussion from the panelists. First of all, we know that we designed this webinar to bring in experts from both the migration force displacement field as well as social protection, as we thought that the nexus of those fields was an important subject to address. So I would first share a little bit about some of the impacts that we see with this population group that we'll be discussing today, and just briefly mention some of the key concepts in social protection where we feel was useful to discuss the emerging practices from the countries that will be highlighted. So first, we know that COVID-19 is a pandemic that has, it's a global crisis that has already implications for people on the move worldwide. And there's a higher degree of vulnerability for refugees and displaced populations due to the conditions of their migration journeys, including their legal status. COVID-19 is an emergency that has worsened pre-existing vulnerabilities for this population that had already experienced difficulty in accessing social protection programs, and especially in countries, in developing countries where most displaced populations, including refugees and internally displaced persons originated and are hosted, are sometimes fragile and under capacity with their health systems particularly. Next. So I know that most of the practitioners in social protection have vast knowledge in the different social assistance programs and services, but for an audience that primarily works on migration or forced displacement that might not necessarily have a conceptual framework on social protection, I would like to just provide and mention that we already have a webinar that presented this framework that provides a category for us to understand many of the social programs. I would like to mention that mainly there's these three categories that you see on this table, where we have social assistance, primarily cash assistance, or what we call non-contributory. And this is where many of the emerging practices that we highlighted today will focus, although many other initiatives address other pillars of social protection, including universal healthcare coverage. As you also see, there's social insurance and labor market policies, but our main focus or some of the focus of the emerging practices are on the social assistance programs. Next slide. And this is just a visual to understand how we're framing the discussion in this COVID-19 pandemic, understanding that it's a shock event. A pandemic could be one, also economic situations or natural hazards could be other situations that may have an impact on routine programming in social protection. And when it comes to adapting or change or responding to these programs, there's these two responses. One where you work on resilience or making changes so your systems don't collapse, but also adaptation, where you actually have to change the program so it meets the context and the needs of individuals that are affected by these shocks. Next slide. And here is also a visual of some of the options for shock responsiveness adaptation. where we have vertical expansions, and this means that for current beneficiaries, they receive either an increase or a longer assistance for the programs. And we also have horizontal expansion that deals with temporarily extending support to new beneficiaries. So these are the kinds of responses that you can see in shock responsive adaptation, and some of the emerging practices that will be highlighted today will discuss how these are implemented. Next slide. With that presentation, I would like to invite Hannah Matinen to showcase the experience of UNHCR implementing cash assistance in response to COVID-19 in collaboration with different governments. So please, Hannah, if you can enable your video or join us and we're eager to listen to your presentation.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see and we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for the introduction. So as I said, we'll be talking very much about the cash response that UNHCR and partners in close collaboration with governments have been able to put in place for the COVID pandemic. Just to give you a quick overview of the presentation before we dive in. So I'll give an overview of the cash response globally to COVID. And in fact, this cash assistance has essentially acted as a social safety net for the most vulnerable during these difficult times. After that, we'll dive into a few country examples. I'll be talking about Pakistan, Rwanda, and Morocco. And in the audience, we have Mohammed Riaz from Pakistan, Akram Barhoui from Morocco, and Michael Ashwang from Rwanda. So in case there are any more detailed questions after the presentations, they are there to provide more detailed answers. We've also done a lot of work with partners in the Americas, but given the following presenters will focus on Colombia, I did not take countries from that continent. Same thing, I'm not focusing on the big ones from the Middle East or Greece, because these countries have been covered in a number of other presentations. Throughout the presentation, I'll be looking into some of the specificities that we face when we're working with refugees and other forcibly displaced populations, and the challenges that we faced almost across the board when we're talking about inclusion into governmental social safety net programs or alignment. Next slide. Karin, can you?
I think you have the control of the slides. Are you projecting?
I should be.
Yeah, you can change the slides.
Okay.
If that works.
Okay, now it's working. Sorry for that. So just very quickly, a quick overview of what we're doing in terms of cash with UNHCR. I think it's the first time we speak in the webinar series. So we're working on scaling up cash since 2015, and at the moment we've got cash transfers in place in over 100 countries. Almost all of our cash is unrestricted, and less than 5% is vouchers or conditional. Since 2015, which is also our Grand Bargain baseline, we've delivered, on the slides is 2.4 billion, but with COVID, we're probably at 2.67 billion of cash assistance to vulnerable refugees and others of concern around the world. And this is actually only the money that has been given to people, so it doesn't take into account any of the overheads. We've also embraced digitization, and before COVID, already a third of our cash was delivered through digital means. And now, as we will see through the case studies, COVID has further enhanced the opportunities to move to digitization. The other important thing with our cash is that from the beginning, we set up a cash delivery model that uses local and national service providers, as we didn't want to set up a fully parallel closed loop system for cash assistance. And this is important because with this, we want to promote refugees' access to formal financial services and financial inclusion. This is actually not possible in many countries because of customer due diligence and know your customer requirements. We'll come to that also in the presentation. But we have secured some 40 contracts, and we're currently procuring more financial services in about 30 countries. Last but not least, we work in close collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders in our cash programs. So without partners, without UN counterparts, without governments, we would obviously not be able to deliver. So now if we look in more detail into our COVID cash assistance, which has essentially complemented the government's responses in several countries. We've distributed some $100 million between February and April and May. If we look at the same period in 2019, there's a 33 million increase, and this increase can largely be attributed to COVID. And the cash has been distributed as unrestricted cash assistance to help people meet their basic needs, but also to reduce any protection risks. So you have more than 65 UNHCR operations that now have launched new cash initiatives or expanded existing cash assistance. So vertical and horizontal expansion, if you like, but even within our own systems. What's interesting to note with this COVID response is the diversity of operations. It ranges really from camps in isolated areas to urban centers. And in all those places, we've been able to scale up rapidly and cover the increasing needs. So despite the movement restrictions and lockdown, we managed to deliver, and recipients have also been able to purchase and access the required commodities and services. We've also seen that the needs linked to COVID have been quite diverse. So in many cases, the hygiene needs have increased. People have also needed cash to stock up for basic needs. But there's also been increasing needs related to communication and connectivity. So access to internet is something, for example, that came up in Greece, where we already had a big cash program that we scaled up. So in very, very practical terms, we have expanded coverage. We have increased transfer values. I just mentioned Greece, but also to cover increased hygiene needs, for example, in Ethiopia, Burundi, in Mauritania. We've set up a number of new programs in Iran, Uganda, Kenya, Pakistan, and Morocco that we will cover in more detail in a bit. We've also done a lot of front loading of payments. So instead of paying every month, we've paid 1 to 2 months ahead, so that we were sure people would get access to their entitlements, but also that they could stock up. Like everybody, we've established hygiene measures at cash distributions, and we've also increased digitization, as I mentioned. In terms of communication with communities, a number of COVID hotlines have been put in place for information collection, but also for assessments. And for example, Morocco, that we will come to, it was through these hotlines that we got information that an additional cash program was needed. We've also tested new technology such as contactless biometrics. And we moved from cash to in-kind. This is very specific to one country, in Sudan, where we did this in order to be aligned with the government response. Now, could we include refugees and others in governmental social protection responses? Could we align our responses to those? There's a number of challenges, and in a way, the photo that you see on the slide is very, very telling about these challenges, because maybe 15, 20 years ago, that little card that you see was the proof of ID and was the proof that the person in question would have access to social assistance or humanitarian assistance. But the world has moved on then, and we're facing new kinds of challenges. The challenges start very much on the bottom, because refugees and forcibly displaced people have a special status. They don't have the right to access governmental social protection schemes because they are not citizens in the country where they reside, in their country of asylum. Governments that also have limited funding, limited capacity, etc., often found themselves prioritizing their own citizens, which is also understandable. This being said, we still promote inclusion as much as possible, and it's one of our key strategic directions. And where we cannot include, we will then align our interventions as much as possible to the government interventions. So if we look at the different challenges in a bit more detail, the number one challenge is really access to recognized ID credentials. You'll see this in Morocco and Pakistan, for example. So often we, UNHCR, we register refugees in collaboration with governments, and they are then issued what's called a refugee ID, which is different from the national ID. Often refugees are not also included in the standard national social registers that are used to establish the lists for social assistance. Again, this we will see in the country examples. The refugee ID that refugees have, it's recognized to a certain extent, but in many countries there are limitations. They may not have the right to work, they may not be able to own land, the movement may be restricted, and they can only stay, let's say, in a camp or a limited geographical area. They may not be able to buy SIM cards and open phone lines. And what's also problematic when it comes to cash assistance, with this ID, they often do not have access to financial services because it's not considered robust enough for know your customer requirements. And this then means that if we want to align with the system that uses a financial service for which you need a different type of ID, we cannot. The second challenge is linked to rights and the status. Because refugees have a different status, their rights are different. Like as I mentioned, if they do not have the right to work, the need for assistance may be bigger. Citizens also may have access to health services or education, whereas refugees don't. So they have less legal income opportunities, and they may have additional costs, even if in reality, when it comes to education and health, we compensate as much as possible to ensure that there's access to health and education for everyone. This said, we know that in reality, refugees also manage to work, but if it's illegal, the conditions are precarious, and they are taking protection risks if they work illegally. So that's why there can be certain incompatibility when we look at the grant size if we compare to humanitarian systems or national social protection systems. The third challenge is the capacity of social protection systems in the countries that host refugees. The world's largest refugee hosting countries also tend to be among the poorest countries. So the capacity can be quite limited, or the systems are just being put in place, or maybe there is no system at all. This is of course not the case everywhere in the world, and for example, Pakistan, they have an extremely developed systems. And in these cases, we then work with governments to enhance any opportunities for alignment, and also to support them to complement their systems by assisting this additional tranche of population, the forcibly displaced or the refugees that would not necessarily have access to the governmental system. The fourth challenge, I put management of forced displacement in countries, but what I really refer to is the governmental or the ministerial setup, especially when it comes to refugees. It's not a blockage at all, but it's something to be aware of and something that is not necessarily very well known. So in various countries, refugee matters actually fall under the ministries of foreign affairs or alike. And we have our traditional counterpart often sitting under that line ministry, whereas social protection falls under social ministries. The situation can be complicated further, because if we talk about ID, national ID is often issued by one line ministry, whereas the refugee ID may well be issued by the refugee authority. Then you can add into this coordination mixture also central banks and national telecommunications authorities that govern access to financial services and mobile connectivity. So in a way, there's a number of different players and line ministries that need to be aligned and coordinated when we talk about the refugee issues. Now I'll jump into the country examples to illustrate a bit more in detail what I just mentioned. So first, I'll take you to Pakistan, where we work very closely with the government, and we actually complement the government's COVID response by horizontally expanding it to refugees. Before going in detail to the COVID cash response, a few quick facts. So there's approximately 1.5 million Afghan refugees that are registered with the government of Pakistan. So the refugee caseload is absolutely huge. As they register, they get a proof of registration, a POR card, which is their ID. The refugees are scattered around the country, and over time they have engaged in casual labor within the informal sector, and they mostly work as unskilled daily wage laborers. And as such, they've been extremely severely affected by the lockdown measures that started in March this year. Nationals have also been extremely affected. And in order to respond to this, the government has launched various safeguarding initiatives for COVID, including a 4-month ESSAS emergency cash program. The program covers some 12 million Pakistani families, so the program is massive. And this ESSAS emergency cash initiative is linked with the broader Benazir income support program, social protection program of the Pakistani government. However, refugees and other persons of concern do not have access to the government social protection response to this ESSAS emergency cash program. And the government actually reached out to us and requested that we complement the assistance and horizontally expand it to cover refugees during these difficult times. We started first payments about a month ago, and the first phase of the, let's say, the refugee of this program targets 37,000 households, which is up to 220,000 individuals, and the budget for the first phase is 3 million. And this is money again that goes to the people, so it doesn't count any overheads. The response was set up in extremely close collaboration with the government overall, but noting here that the refugee matters fall under SAFRAN, which is the Ministry of States and Frontier Regions in Pakistan. The program mirrors fully the ESSAS emergency cash grant size and durations. It's for 4 months, and the grant size is about 12,000 rupees. It also aligns with the targeting in terms of criteria. But because the beneficiaries for the governmental response, the ESSAS COVID response, are pulled from the National Socio-Economic Registry that doesn't include refugees and non-nationals. The refugee beneficiary lists cannot be pulled from there. So that's where there's a little disconnect. However, there's another database of the 1.4 million registered refugees. So based on that, we then proceeded to selection through community outreach and additional profiling to find those that are most vulnerable. The cash is delivered through urgent money orders, which is a service that's done by Pakistan Post Office, and they have been extremely helpful and reactive. The urgent money orders by Pakistan Post Office are also used by the government to reach the most vulnerable in areas where there's otherwise limited service coverage. But the large parts of the governmental cash assistance is delivered through BISIP cards. In fact, you will see this card on the photo on the bottom right corner of the presentation. So it's a debit card that is usable in various banks and POS machines around the country. But in order to get this, you need a computerized national ID card, which the refugees do not have. So that's why we could not fully piggyback and use the same delivery mechanism that government uses for ESSES. So this is actually a great success. It's been extremely rapid. We work extremely well with the government, with the Pakistan Post Office. So we'd like to strongly commend the collaboration that we've had and that has made this response possible. Now we shall change continents and go to Northern Africa and to Morocco. In fact, there we have a very similar scenario where we complement and horizontally expand the government social safety net response to COVID. So the government has put in place a social transfer, cash transfer, that targets some 4.5 million Moroccan households. But that specific program, again, is not accessible to refugees. What's interesting also to note that this COVID cash transfer by the government is the first time that they put in place such a large-scale, unconditional, unrestricted cash transfer program. As you see in the slide, in Morocco, the refugee caseload is much smaller than in Pakistan. We've got about 8,000 refugees and 4,000 asylum seekers. And what happens is that when an asylum seeker comes to the country, we, UNHCR, we register them, we issue them an asylum certificate, and then the refugees are referred to an ad hoc commission for refugees for status approval, which is the governmental body. And based on that, those that are confirmed by the national authorities, they will be then granted a refugee ID and a sojourn permit. Now with COVID, all this is done remotely and online, which is very remarkable because there were a lot of processes ongoing and several people were still in the middle of their status determination. So with these tweaks, COVID did not stop refugees accessing their stay permits and IDs. In fact, you can see the top left photo, you can see iris scanning as part of the normal registration process. Obviously now we're not doing iris scanning in the same way that we used to do before COVID. So now going back to the cash program, it was actually set up because refugees called us through hotlines and emails and explained the increased needs that they had due to COVID. In Morocco, many of the refugees they rely on daily work, and some of them may have more predictable activities, but because of the lockdown due to COVID, they did not get any income anymore, and they could not access the support made available to nationals. So the cash assistance that we put in place fully mirrors the government's COVID social assistance in grant size, duration, and also delivery mechanism here. We both use Albarit Bank for over-the-counter payments. So there's no bank accounts as such involved, it's an over-the-counter payment. And the refugee ID here is considered as an adequate proof of ID for this type of delivery. Targeting is, however, different. It's a bit like in Pakistan. The government targets households that are already included in the database for RAMED, which is the government subsidized health insurance regime for the poor. This is based on socioeconomic status, and there's a specific database available for this. But again, refugees and non-nationals are not included. So we had to go through another targeting system based on the refugee database. Another interesting development in Morocco when it comes to social protection is that refugees will be included as a subsample into a forthcoming national COVID impact assessment. The assessment is done by the National Statistical Bureau and the High Commissioner for Planning. This is quite interesting because traditionally refugees haven't been included in national poverty surveys or alike. Although I think in the last few years there's been increasing focus on refugees and studying also their socioeconomic situation. Another interesting development in Morocco is that the government is also planning to start a new cash transfer project for the most vulnerable Moroccan households. This is not linked to COVID. It's something that's been discussed already before. So we have engaged in various advocacy efforts with our partners to include refugees also in it, and we will see what comes out. But in a way, we can say that COVID and this cash transfer, which was very much aligned with the governmental response, created this opportunity for closer collaboration and closer alignment between refugees and nationals. And yes, we will see what will come out of these advocacy efforts. But now let us move to East Africa, to Rwanda, which is my last example. So Rwanda is quite different from Morocco and Pakistan, and it's maybe more in line with what people traditionally would think about when they hear the word refugees. So you got almost 150,000 refugees, and the vast majority of them live in 6 refugee camps across the country. Then you have 11,500 people living in 2 urban centers. In camps, the income generating opportunities are quite limited. The demographic pressure is high overall, but still some refugees can have access to land. And in the urban areas, as in many other parts of the world, the refugees rely on unskilled daily labor. And in Rwanda, they actually have de facto the right to work. But both populations have been hit hard by the COVID and the lockdown measures. In Rwanda, the government has also put in place a COVID cash transfer program, which is open to vulnerable Rwandans. And here, perhaps just a parenthesis, that overall social protection is relatively new in Rwanda if you compare to a number of other countries. And the right to social protection was written in the constitutions in 2015, and now there's a new social protection strategic plan that covers from 2000 up to 2024, and it includes some cash transfers or non-contributory cash transfers. Refugees do not have access to the government's COVID response, and there is no governmental safety net cash transfer or in-kind transfer as such in place in the camps. The response in the camps is very much humanitarian funded, but I would still like to highlight that overall Rwanda offers a fairly favorable environment for refugees. There's de facto right to work, borders are open, and the government of Rwanda has also made commitments to start integrating refugees into national health insurance schemes, education systems, and documentation systems. And in Rwanda, like in the other examples that I said, refugees fall under a different line ministry. It's the Ministry of Disaster Management and Refugees Minima. And now in a bit more detail about the COVID response. I'll first talk about camps. So as I said, there's really no real social protection or governmental social safety net to align to, or to include refugees in the camps. In normal times, WFP and us were the biggest providers of cash transfers in the camps, and there's regular transfers on a monthly basis, which is essentially the safety net. And for COVID, we used this already existing system to ensure that the increased needs were covered. And we did this by front-loading payments. So instead of monthly payments, we did one big payment that was done that covered 3 months in one go. And we also increased the transfer value to cover the additional needs due to COVID. So in a way, this was an internal vertical expansion, if I use the terminology that Nancy introduced. The cash assistance is delivered through Equity Bank, with whom we have a long-standing working relationship in the country. And again, important to note, already before COVID, the government and the central bank allowed refugees to access real personal bank accounts based on the refugee ID. So people already had bank accounts and debit cards in place. I'm insisting a little bit on the access to personal bank accounts and financial services, because this is really the first step towards financial inclusion. And in many countries, refugees cannot own bank accounts or mobile money accounts under their own names because the legal frameworks do not allow it. So with COVID, you will see in the photo, the central bank issued a circular where they encouraged the use of digital means and payments. And now, thanks to this, refugees got access to mobile money as well. So we worked closely with the financial service provider, and they integrated the phone numbers of refugees to their database so they can use bank accounts, cards, and mobile money from the same instance.
Hey, Hannah, do you mind if we wrap up so we can move on to the next speaker? Have enough time? Thank you.
Sorry, this is my last thing. So in the same line, we work also with the financial service provider and the traders and increase the point of sale machine network so that we could reduce the handling of physical cash, because that's a potential vector of transmission. We also worked with the government and the central bank to ensure that there was still liquidity available in the camps, because the government put in place fairly strict liquidity numbers transactions that could be done per day. So that was temporarily lifted so that the money could be channeled to the camp. The digitization still worked really well, because instead of having 5 replenishments that we often need for one round of cash transfers, we only needed 1. Now, yeah, very briefly, we also set in place a new cash transfer for urban refugees, which was in line with the government response. I will stop here. Sorry for having spoken too much, and thank you very much.
Hopefully we'll have time to expand a little bit more on these interesting examples. Thank you so much, Hannah, for this great intervention. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from opportunities and challenges, and adapting or expanding these social protection initiatives propelled by UNHCR. So with that, I would like to also encourage participants to continue posting their questions. We have a few share already in the chat. In case we don't have time to address them in the Q&A, we can certainly follow up and answer them. So let's move on to the presentation of Tania Nino from the World Food Program Office in Colombia, who will tell us about the shock responsive social protection pilot in Colombia as a complementary initiative to the national protection response to COVID-19. And then from that, Camilo will follow this presentation as they have a joint presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see that, and we can hear you.
Fine. I'm just going to just 1 second. 1 second, I'm going to, okay. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Together with Camilo from Gerencia de Frontera, we're going to present our child responsive social protection intervention in the Arauca region, which is located on the border with Venezuela. We have prepared for the next 30 minutes, 20 minutes, this content. First is this introduction I'm doing right now. Then Camilo from Gerencia de Frontera is going to tell us about the government response to the migration crisis in Colombia and the extraordinary measures that has been adopted to respond to COVID-19. Then I will explain the details of our operation, and at the end, we would like to close the intervention with some inputs for the wider debate about social protection, migration, and COVID-19. Before giving the floor to Camilo, I just want to mention that Colombia has been widely recognized for its openness to migrants and for implementing a very comprehensive policy to respond to a migration crisis. The COVID-19 is just an extra layer to a already very complex situation. It's a huge challenge for the state, and of course, we are here to support the Colombian government. So I just give now the floor to Camilo. Please go ahead, Camilo.
Thank you, Tania, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to share what we are doing in Colombia. And thanks everyone in the audience for spending time with us today. So basically, next slide, Tania. So I want to share with you quite briefly details about the unprecedented context of sudden and massive migration we are facing in Colombia. How we are responding from the government to this new context, at least new for us. And how we have had to adapt our response in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we will connect to this joint intervention with between the government and WFP, Tania was mentioned. So first, over 5.2 million people have left Venezuela in the last 3 years, just to give you a little bit of context. A few comparable migration flows in terms of magnitude and intensity are currently in recent history comparable to this situation. It took almost, just to give you an idea, it took almost 6 years for the Syrian exodus to reach the 6 million people mark. Venezuelan migration is advancing at a pace almost twice as high, which is sadly remarkable considering that it is not being driven by an armed conflict. Colombia is by far absorbing the bulk of this outflow. Next, Tania. So how we are responding to this context from the point of view of the government of Colombia. First, as a result of this exodus, Colombia is facing mixed migration inflows, each of which poses specific challenges. First, there are over 1.8 million fellow Venezuelans intending to remain in Colombian territory. Second, you have over 500,000 migrants entitled to Colombian nationality, be they Colombian returnees or Venezuelans born to at least one Colombian parent. Also, we have almost 1.5 million Venezuelans who are crossing the country in transit to other destinations. Those 1.5 million Venezuelans per year crossing the country. And fourth, we have a permanent circular flow at the border with Venezuela, with between 40,000 and 50,000 people crossing the border back and forth per day. So despite the challenges each of these types of flows pose, Colombia's stance has been of openness and open arms. Through temporary regularization measures, the government has granted temporary permits to remain in the country to almost 780,000 Venezuelan migrants in over 2 years. We are currently enhancing the capacity of Migración Colombia, which is Colombia's migration authority, to put regularization mechanisms within the reach of most migrants. We have also granted nationality to over 43,000 newly born to Venezuelans in Colombia, to whom the regime had denied recognition as their citizen, thus leaving them at the risk of statelessness. More recently, new regularization mechanisms were put in place to grant permits to irregular migrants that secure a formal job offer. Next, Tanya. The factors driving this this survival exodus will hardly change in the medium to long term. We know that. In my position as part of the team in charge of coordinating government responses to migration at the presidency of the Republic of Colombia, we're thinking through ways to realize the humanitarian development nexus so that we are able to integrate migrants into existing social protection networks. Let me explain this in more detail as regards to the health and education, as regards the measures we're taking in the health and education sectors. Next, Daniel. In terms of, as regards health, migrants in Colombia have free access to the public network of health service providers. During the last 2.5 years, Colombia covered the provision of 5.46 million health services to Venezuelan migrants, including over 140,000 pregnant women and 1.85 million vaccines applied. Despite these efforts, there's a widening gap in access to health services between regular and irregular migrants. While regular migrants can be registered in the social security system, those in irregular status can only have access to emergency care. We're thinking through ways to closing this gap. Next, Tanya. In terms of education, migrant children have full access to the public school system, regardless of their migratory status. Today, 325,000 Venezuelan children are enrolled in Colombian schools, nearly all of whom are in free public schools. In addition, migrant children also have access to school feeding programs, over 134,000 children included to date, and to the public network of family welfare. The government is currently giving the last touches to a new mechanism to allow Venezuelan children enrolled in the school system to regularize their migratory status so that they can take official tests and get access to public programs of technical and vocational training. Next, Daniel. So the magnitude of the migration inflow from Venezuela is such that it is already having effects in the country's population pyramid. Just imagine what it would be like increasing your country's population 4.5% overnight, meaning over in the span of 2.5 years. That's massive. That's sudden. That was unpredictable, and considering the dire state of Venezuelan institutions, we don't expect a massive return of migrants, even in the eventuality of a political shift towards a true democracy. We're therefore working with a long-term public policy approach that enables us as a country, as a society, to make migration into a development opportunity for both migrants and host communities. To this end, we are working on a policy agenda comprising 5 pillars. First, we have including access to healthcare, access to education, and protection to vulnerable groups whose specific needs must be met. Here we are talking about women, children, indigenous population. These are the 3 blue columns you see in this diagram. We also have a provision of these provision of these basic services should be coupled with measures to ease migrants' access to the job market and to entrepreneurship opportunities, and with the strategies to mitigate risks, both real and perceived, in terms of citizen security and social cohesion. These are represented by the two gray columns in the diagram. And also, we have to make strides in 5 additional cross-cutting enablers that will make possible progress in these 5 pillars. Here we're talking about regularization, full identification, communications, institutional coordination, and financial support, including within government budgets, the donor community, and the private sector. These pillars, these 6 cross-cutting enablers, constitute what we consider is a comprehensive policy agenda on migration, a comprehensive and a realistic policy agenda on migration. These are the priorities Colombia as a society, as a country, as a government will have to focus on in the medium to long term over the next decade or so, if we are to make migration into a development opportunity, because we know this migration inflow is not going to stop. Far from it. We expect it to keep increasing at a persistent pace over the next few years. That was the scenario before the pandemic. We think that scenario will still hold after the pandemic. This is this is basically our roadmap. But then the pandemic came. Next, Tanya. The pandemic came, and with it, it was necessary to, and with it, a series of emerging challenges emerged, and we have to adapt our response accordingly. The government's response plan as regards migration from Venezuela comprises 6 aspects, which I am going to mention in passing for the interest of time. Next, Tanya. As regards border management, in the midst of the pandemic, starting March 14th, we opted for closing the border with Venezuela, exclusively out of health concerns. This is the very first time in history that the border is closed from the Colombian side. Considering that many Venezuelans cross the border to receive treatment in Colombian hospitals, we enabled humanitarian corridors for dealing with persons with specific needs. We are also coordinating the organized and paced return of migrants. To date, over 71,000 migrants have returned to Venezuela between mid-March and last week. We expect most of these people to come back once lockdown measures in Colombia are relaxed and once economic activity start coming back to normal. In terms of healthcare access, COVID-19 related services are provided to migrants through the public network, regardless of their migratory status. As for migratory status, the migration authorities suspended expiration dates of temporary permits for all migrants from Venezuela while lockdown measures are in place. And from the government, we have also included migrants within the target population of a massive operation for providing in-kind food assistance to 1.7 million vulnerable households. More details about this in a second. The next study. Also, it's been necessary to adjust the response of the international community present in Colombia in close coordination with UN agencies, as well as with international and local civil society organizations. We have reshuffled the priorities in all components of humanitarian action, so that migrants, again, regardless of their migratory status, have access to aid packages that help them coping with the economic restrictions of lockdown measures. Next. Among the government programs set up for providing assistance to vulnerable populations in the midst of the pandemic, the Ingreso Solidario program stands out for its magnitude and its outreach. Ingreso Solidario is an unconditional cash transfer program targeted to extremely poor households, not included in similar programs, or that are considered as highly vulnerable. An estimated 3 million households currently comply with these conditions. So it's starting from scratch on March the 25th, 2 months later, on May 28th, over 1.7 million people had received a payment, including over 500,000 unbanked people. This is unprecedented. 598 migrants from Venezuela who were included in the SISBEN registry, which is the country's main registry to identify needs of the poorest segment of the population, were eligible for Ingreso Solidario. As of June the 5th, over 17,000 people have received a payment. That is from the migrant population eligible for this program. We're currently looking for ways to increase the number of migrant households that could have access to Ingreso Solidario. Next, Tania. I referred previously to a massive operation for providing in-kind food assistance to vulnerable households countrywide. This operation included 200,000 packages for vulnerable migrants in 71 priority municipalities, of which over 135,000 have already been delivered to date through coordination with local authorities, UN agencies, Venezuelan diaspora groups, and other relevant local actors. Next, Tania. And finally, it was necessary to design a specific multi-actor intervention plans in 4 key localities hosting large concentration of migrants, which you can see on the map. These 4 locations by no means represent the only hotspots where specific interventions would be needed. But, you know, in the context of an emergency, the decisions had to be made within the frame of an emergency and of a contingency plan necessary to respond to the pandemic. From the government, we think that in the new normality post-pandemic, the need of advancing in the policy priorities to make migration into a development opportunity, those 5 pillars and 6 enabling factors in the previous diagram, will be even more pressing, and it will require speeding up improvement in official registries of migrants on which to base public policy making. The joint intervention with WFP we have embarked on in the Arauca region may give us answers in these respects, and more details on this with Tania. Over.
Thank you, Camilo. Perfect. Now I'm just going to get into the details of our joint intervention. First of all, we would like to mention why are we doing this, which is the purpose of these operations. At first, as World Food Program, we want to complement the government's response to COVID-19 and also to strengthen the responsiveness of the social protection system. Before getting into the details, I need to provide some key context information to understand our operation. So I have to mention that Colombia has quite a strong social protection system to fight poverty. I'm just referring here to the social programs. There are more initiatives and strategies, but I'm referring here to the social programs. So we have a very large conditional cash transfer program called Familias en Acción, Families in Action. It reaches over 2.5 million households, and the purpose is to complement the income of the poorest. We have another program, a large one, to support the elderly without pension. It reaches over 0.5 million people. These programs do not cover all poor families. They are very large. In fact, Familias en Acción is the 3rd largest in the region. However, they don't get to cover all the poor families in Colombia, and they do not cover migrants. As Camilo mentioned it before, in Colombia, we have a means test. Is this targeting mechanism that is called SISBEN. And we call it SISBEN 4 because it's the latest version of this survey that is made across the country to see the level income of the most vulnerable people. So first, in order to get access to the social programs, you have to be registered in the SISBEN. For vulnerable Colombians and regular migrants can be registered here. Then each social program is going to implement its own selection process. So this is what we have before COVID-19. When we are hit by the pandemic, the government decides to implement additional transfer. It's what we call, and Nancy mentioned it before, vertical expansion. It means these big conditional transfer programs, they provide an extra transfer for the beneficiaries. And also the government put in place this program that just Camilo mentioned before, Ingreso Solidario, that is to reach exactly these people who are outside of the traditional social programs. So this is the context to understand our intervention. We decided to implement this in Arauca, which, as you can see in the map, is on the border with Venezuela. We did it because it has a very difficult situation. It has a complex security conditions. There are several illegal groups operating in this area. Of course, as you can see, it's very close to Venezuela. It has been hugely affected by the mass migration, and it has very challenging socioeconomic indicators. Now I want to get into the heart of this intervention. In shock-responsive social protection, we have identified different ways in which the social platforms or programs can react to emergencies. One of these forms is something that we call piggybacking. And what does it mean? It means it's a very close work with the government. And it means that we support our intervention in one of the central and stable components of the social infrastructure of the state. Here, for this operation, we're talking about the information system, the social registry, the official database of the state. Is the one we are talking before, we mentioned it before, that is called SISBEN, is the means test, the targeted instrument of the state. So with this database tell us which is the income level of the most vulnerable. And the leading agency in social protection, Prosperidad Social, let us access to this information, and at the same time, Gerencia de Frontera allow us to access the official registry, the database of the regular migrants in Colombia, in Arauca. So we are very grateful to the Colombian government for its trust, and we know that this information is very important. It's very sensitive information, and we take this very, very seriously because we know they trust in our work. So we have this information, and what do we do? What do we have here? I just want to explain what we have received from the state. First, the SISBEN, as you can see here, we receive the records of 4 host communities. We decided to work for the case of Colombians with extreme poverty, with households in extreme poverty. We receive almost 12,000 records of households. It means almost 34,000 people. And in this SISBEN, we also receive the databases of regular migrants, of those who have this special transitional permit. We receive almost 800 households, records of households. It means more than 2,000 people. And for migrants, we are also using the records of people on moderate poverty, that is over 400 households. This is the case for the SISBEN. The SISBEN, as is the official registry of the state, is very detailed, it's sophisticated. It even has coordinates to locate the people, and is organized by households and, of course, income level. We also receive from Gerencia de Frontera the database of the regular migrants, right? The pet holders. Here we receive almost 11,000 records. We break it down in adults, more than 9,000 adults, and 1,700 children. The difference is that the database of the migrants is not organized by household composition, and it do not have the income level. So we receive this information. What are we going to do with this? First, we have put in place a validation process. The people that are in these databases and that we are going to be able to contact, they are going to receive a transfer for the World Food Program. As I was speaking, the people are already accessing this transfer in Arauca region right now. So with the validation, what we do is we confirm the information, of course, to proceed with payment, that, as I said, is happening right now. But also we want to take this opportunity to contribute to government's efforts in the response to the COVID, and of course to strengthen the social protection system. So what we're doing here is we are working on the findings of this new of the means test databases. As I mentioned before, this is Ben 4 is the latest version. Even it wasn't published before the COVID, but because of the COVID, the government decided to use it because it's the most updated database that the States has. So we want to do some findings, to get some findings in order to give it back to the government and strengthen this important instrument. I just want to give an example to illustrate what I'm saying. We have found in our validation process that, for example, beneficiaries, they do not update the information, and this is the responsibility. We have a situation here where the social registry is having difficulties to keep up with the pace of the life of the poorest. It's so complicated. And there is this co-responsibility on the side of the beneficiaries to do their part. And if they change their contact details, if they change the place where they live, they should update this information. So we want to keep working. We need to better understand. Everything about social protection is understanding, getting into the details, why this is happening, why people do not update the information. Maybe they are facing some barriers, maybe they don't know, they are not aware of this. So this is the kind of findings that we are working on and that we want to give back to the government. Of course, we are also taking the opportunity to gather more information about the social economic impact of the COVID-19 associated, of course, to food security and with the gender perspective. This is for the two databases. But for the migrants databases, we also want to update the information and we want to organize it by households. It means that we're going to give back to the Gerencia de Frontera an updated database organized by household so it can be used for other government agencies and other actors of the international community. And in this way, they can easily and quicker reach the migrants. All these discussion about the registry is very important in social protection, and this is the heart of our operation. And we believe this is like this is our contribution to the wider debate. If the states have a very solid social registry and an update information, is definitely so much easier to reach out to people in times of shock. Colombia, the state, is making a big effort in this regard. It has been recognized because of this, and we, with this intervention, we are being part of this effort. I'm just going to go now quickly to the rest of the operation so we can reach the final slide about the main or important debates around COVID-19 migration and social protection. As I mentioned it before, we're going to provide the cash transfers, and to the people, for the people that we are not going to be able to reach because they are far away in remote areas, because they're over 70 or are irregular migrants, we are also working with the Risk Management Authority to provide in-kind assistance. This intervention also includes an evaluation. This is key to strengthen the responsiveness of the social protection system. We're going to evaluate the result of the extraordinary measures that have been adopted by the government. We're going to and of course, this intervention, we're going to provide recommendations. And for us, as a World Food Program, we want to get a strategy to better support the Colombian national protection, social protection system. With this slide, I finished the details of the operation. Just to mention, this intervention prioritized women as main recipients because we know the impact that the COVID is having on women is a gender impact, and we are doing this intervention has a very gender perspective in all parts of the implementation. I will go back to this point at the end. Now, with Camilo, this is our last slide. We would like to just get some input to keep up the discussion about social protection, migration, and COVID-19. So I will leave Camilo to start this, and then I will end the presentation. Camilo, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Tanya. Tanya, could you go to the previous slide? Yeah, thanks. Well, I would like just to highlight 4 points for us to think about in this new context we are all facing everywhere. First, in the case of countries of transit and destination of migrants, we're wondering what the new migration dynamics post-pandemic will be like, what it will happen once we get back to some resemblance of normality, once lockdown measures are relaxed, once borders are reopened, once international flights are in service again. What it will happen in this new migratory context, and that's definitely something we must be thinking about and preparing to. A second point we would like to think about with you it has to do with cost-effective mechanisms for keeping up-to-date registries of migrant populations. Both Tanya and I told you about the difficulties we are facing trying to get information about the potential beneficiaries for massive assistance programs, and we have also shared through this joint intervention how we are tackling part of these challenges. But the question remains: how can we, from government agencies, maintain, build quality administrative registries with up-to-date data of migrants without the complexity this population has in terms of their mobility, their often in irregular status, etc. A third point is that bear in mind that in the case of Colombia, this migration influx from Venezuela adds an additional layer of complexity to an already difficult or challenging situation, to say the least. Before that, just for you to remember that up to 3 years ago, when no one could imagine what Venezuelan migration would be like in such a short period of time, we already had more than enough in our plate as policymakers. We had rising levels of income inequality in the country. We were in the aftermath of a controversial, to say the least, a peace accord, and we were about to embark on the implementation of this peace accord. We were dealing with issues of illegal economies and the persistence of organized crime in specific pockets of the country, and then it came this migration inflow from Venezuela, and then the pandemic added to the complexity. So how could our response mechanisms and our social protection systems and the administrative registries underpinning these social protection systems could be better prepared to adapt to these changing realities? And finally, I think that we also have to think about the budget constraints we have from state and government institutions to better cope with this with emerging challenges such as the ones deriving from the pandemic, and also to underline the need for more flexibility from the international community, from donors and from international organizations and UN agencies to make their structures and operations more flexible to better cope with these new challenges. And the Colombian case has been a vivid laboratory, so to speak, to put in place these new ways of working that these overlapping emergencies and contingencies pose. Over to you, Tania.
Thank you, Camilo. I can see Nancy's there, so we are finishing up, Nancy, now with the last 2 points. Just quickly, just to mention that the social protection system in Colombia has stretched too much, that for sure it's going to be a different one post-COVID-19. It's going to be difficult, of course, to roll back all the transitional programs, all the vertical and horizontal expansion and all the adjustments to the operation, because of the need is too great. But the level of adaptation that Colombia has implemented at different levels, at a contributory and no contributory social protection system, is so large that we are witnessing a new social protection system. And for sure, I believe it's going to be, after this experience, definitely is going to be better prepared for a future shock. Finally, just to mention that in terms of poverty reduction, it's just so painful to see how we have Colombia have registered a setback. Colombia and all the countries in the region, of course, but the result is just painful, because it means we are almost for having 27% of people in poverty. We are hitting the estimations is that we're going to hit almost 33%. So it's hard. It also have a very differentiated gender impact, affecting especially women in Colombia, and we can already see this in the latest unemployment figures, where women unemployment is twice higher men's unemployment. So I will leave it here because our time is up. On behalf of the World Food Program, thank you very much for this opportunity. Of course, thank you to the Colombian government. Gracias, Camilo and Nancy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, both Camilo and Tania, for that great intervention. So I know we have less time than we planned for Q&A, so I'll try to prioritize some of the questions that were more general. I also want to invite Hannah to open your mic or your camera if your connection allows, so we can all be here in this last session of this webinar. I want to announce that we have a poll for feedback for the translation service. So I'll switch to Spanish for that. Para los participantes en español, nos gustaría saber cómo evalúan el servicio de interpretación, para también considerarlo en futuros webinarios. So I'll leave a little bit of time for people to answer the survey or this poll, so we can evaluate the service of the translation. But as people are answering questions, well, one thing I want to move into is some of the questions that we received in the chat. I think many of them will follow up on the written summary and the Q&A. But one general question that I think applies for both the Colombian case and the other country examples that UNHCR has shared comes from roads. And this is regarding, so I'll read the question. Since COVID-19 started impacting on operations, with new ground, so focusing on opportunities for cash-based interventions has opened up, and what achievements and milestones might have been lost during this pandemic. So I think both countries can, or both, all of our panelists can mention about that. And specifically for the Colombian case, there was a question on the choice between in-kind food assistance versus cash food assistance as a modality. So what factors are considered in those type of assistance for specific regions? I know you have both, but if there's any insight that you can give us into what the evaluation criteria. So we can probably start with Hannah with UNHCR addressing on this opportunities and perhaps challenges with the COVID on the cash-based operations.
Okay, thank you. I think in a way all the 4 case studies have shown the opportunities that COVID has presented for refugees, and because with increasing needs and with the scale of needs that is so huge, impacting everybody more or less across the board, this alignment and closer linkages with existing social protection systems to whatever extent we can is definitely something that COVID has brought forward. I think we will probably see more of these. I like to be optimistic. When the longer term socioeconomic impacts of COVID also are put more on forth, and there may be some additional funding possibly also coming to this. So with this new funding, and also if it's just adjusting existing programs or reshuffling existing funding to see how can we together as UN, humanitarian organizations, governments, etc., make the best out of it to promote inclusion to the extent possible. On the challenges is we will be going through a global economic downturn, so funding availability, cash will be an issue across the board. Very briefly, my view. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to Camilo and Tania with answering the same question, and on the second one, we post on in-kind food assistance and cash food assistance modality.
Maybe I can take that one, Tania. The key factor to decide whether we should prioritize in-kind over cash or vice versa is the availability of information on the beneficiary population. Basically, the better the information we have, the more likely it would be that we prioritize cash-based programs over in-kind operations. For the time being, considering our considering the limitations of the information available, we have had to prioritize in-kind delivery of in-kind food assistance. But we are intent on changing this, and eventually, as our administrative registries on the migrant population get better, through this joint intervention with WFP, and through other initiatives we are currently working on with government actors, hopefully we will be able to progressively transition towards more cash-based, massive cash-based interventions, which no doubt are more cost-effective and easier to manage and easier to understand even for the intended beneficiaries. Tania, over to you.
I think you just what you mentioned it, and from our point of view, we are also complementing the government's response that has been very strong in terms of cash transfer. This intervention has the transfer that we're giving has the same value of the government program. As Camilo mentioned it, we adapt where the people we can reach with transfer, we go with transfer. The people we cannot, we go with in kind, but we are aiming to reach everybody as much as we can. Over.
Well, an additional question we have that could be answered by all our panelists as well is this context, this urban context. So we have Linda Bayer, who would like to hear more about the focus on refugee populations in urban context and any considerations this poses to a specific operational aspects. So if any of you want to share a bit about this context, that will be helpful.
I can start with that one. In the specific case of Colombia, migration from Venezuela is primarily an urban phenomenon. From the official estimates we have in government about the total number of migrants remaining in Colombian territory to date, and I told you about over 1.8 million people to date, and we estimate that over 70% of that total is concentrated in 13 urban areas. And if you expand if you include in this list the next 10 cities with the highest estimated numbers of migrants, you would complete over 85% of the total migrant population. So that will be about 25 municipalities concentrating 85% of the total migrant population out of over 1,100 municipalities we have in Colombia. So this is a primarily urban phenomenon. It is not rural as in other settings of massive immigration. In Colombia, it is urban. And the other interesting feature of the Colombian context that it is relevant for this question is that contrary to what one could think from the outside, most of the bulk of the migrant population is spread all over the country. Only 30% of the estimated number of migrants are currently residing on border regions, on municipalities along the border with Venezuela. Most people are spread all over the countries. From those 325,000 children enrolled in the public school system in Colombia, we have registries of children registered in more than 1,000 municipalities. So basically, migrants are everywhere. They are spread all over the countries. They are concentrated in the main urban centers, countrywide, and therefore, in the case of Colombia, we are considering this issue as an urban development challenge, more than anything. Not so much in rural areas. Although of course there are some specific localities where migrant population into traditionally urban rural economies is important, but that's definitely not the case. It is more the exception than the rule. Over to Tanya and Hannah in case you want to expand or elaborate on this.
Okay, I'll jump in quickly. For us, it really depends from country to country. In Pakistan, you've got about 70% that are urban or semi-urban, and the rest are in refugee villages. In Africa, you have large populations in the camps. In the Middle East, refugees would be more urban in nature. And I guess the special operational considerations would really be context specific. So if you have large camp populations, there's a risk that many of the urban refugees may be invisible and they may not be registered, especially if they do not have the right to work or right to move around. So that would be one of the key things first to understand who are around. Now I understand in Colombia there's a good handle on where people are, but this is not always the case. Again, in terms of operational considerations, people being in urban centers, to a certain extent, it is easier to put in place responses. Distances are not so far. We're talking about cash markets and services are often available. Service providers would be available and so on. Over.
Okay, well, I think that this is what we have time for, unfortunately, but I'm sure that we can continue on the discussion online and also with follow-up responses to the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. If you agree, we can move forward into concluding the webinar. Just as final remarks, one thing is that we hope that by centering the discussion on social protection responses on a population segment that has limited or no rights to social programs such as refugee asylum seekers and other forcibly displaced persons, we can continue on the reflection on how we can promote inclusion in the national protection programs as part of this long-term solutions so that we can move beyond just a humanitarian vision or just immediate responses, but more sustainable responses. So with that, I would like to conclude by thanking our wonderful panelists for your presentations, your inputs, answers, and the reflections that you pose for us, lessons learned, opportunities, and challenges that we need to continue to explore. To our participants, thank you so much for your attention and valuable questions that you posed to further this discussion. I want to give a special thanks to the socialprotection.org team for making this webinar happen. And I want to kindly ask the audience to answer the webinar survey that will be sent to you as you close the window after we conclude, so this can help us improve future webinars. I also want to just remind you to please join the online communities on social protection responses to COVID-19 to keep updated on future webinars and to receive further information and materials. I look forward to seeing you again in our next webinar on migrants and COVID-19 emerging practices that will take place on June 30th. Thanks again, Hannah. Thanks again, Tania and Camilo. Thank you all, and stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.